Continue with next part more unique and lengthy in the form of paragraph 900 words. The night began like any other Halloween, with laughter echoing through the streets and leaves crunching beneath hurried feet. Children dressed as ghosts, monsters and heroes ran door to door, their small hands clutching candy bags that grew heavier with every stop. The air smelled of burning pumpkins and damp earth, and the moon hung low over Harrow's End like a pale coin dropped into an ocean of mist. Every house on Birch Lane had its lights glowing, every porch crowded with jack-o'-lanterns grinning their crooked smiles. But at the far end of the street there stood one house that never joined in, the Miller house. Its windows were dark, its porch empty, and its silence louder than the laughter all around. Parents always told their children to stay away from it. They said the house was abandoned, that strange things had been seen moving inside long after midnight. Yet as the night deepened and courage mixed with curiosity, someone always made a dare. It was almost tradition. Every year one child would walk up to that porch, knock 3 times, and run before the door creaked open. No one ever waited to see if anyone answered. They said that those who lingered heard something whisper their name from the darkness inside. That year, the air felt different, colder, heavier. The fog rolled in earlier than usual, swallowing the road until even the streetlights seemed to hang in midair. Dogs barked without reason, and the laughter that had once filled the town began to fade. Still, the night carried on as it always did, because no one wanted to admit that fear could take hold of a place so ordinary. Near midnight, a woman named Ruth was closing her curtains when she saw it. A light flickered in the window of the old Miller house. It was faint, golden and pulsing, as if a candle had just been lit inside. She stood there for a moment, watching, waiting for it to go out. But it did not. Instead, she thought she saw movement, something crossing the room, tall and uneven like a shadow with weight. Her heart began to beat faster, and she pulled the curtain shut, whispering a small prayer. She told herself it was probably a trick of the fog. Still, she kept every light in her house on that night. On the other side of town, a group of teenagers were filming themselves walking through the neighborhood. They had a cheap camera, one of those small ones with a shaking lens that caught too much darkness and not enough detail. They wanted to capture something real, something scary, something that would make their video go viral. One of them, a tall boy with a mask on the side of his face, pointed toward the end of Birch Lane. The camera followed, and through the grainy image, the old Miller house appeared, its front porch dimly glowing. As if waiting, they argued for a while, laughing, pretending they were not afraid. But one of them, Colin, said he would do it. He said every Halloween needed a story, and tonight he would make one. The camera followed him as he walked down the street alone, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The others stayed behind, their voices fading into nervous whispers. The lens caught the outline of his back as he moved closer, step by step, until the house filled the frame. The porch light buzzed faintly above him, the sound mixing with the wind. He lifted his hand and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed, soft but sharp, like hollow wood against something old and hollow in return. There was no answer at first. Then the light above him flickered twice and went out. The camera caught the moment clearly, the darkness swallowing him completely, his small flashlight beam trembling as he turned it toward the door. The door began to open, slow and deliberate, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. A sound came from inside, faint and wet like footsteps in mud. Colin stepped back, his breath visible in the cold air. Someone in the background called his name, but he did not turn. He was staring at something just beyond the door, something that seemed to be staring back. The camera shook as one of the others shouted for him to run. The image blurred for a second. The flashlight dropped, and the last frame showed the porch, empty except for the open door swinging slightly in the wind. By morning, the police were called. The teenagers had fled and returned with adults, but Colin was gone. They found his flashlight lying in the dirt and the door still open. Inside, the house was empty. No furniture, no footprints, nothing but a smell that made one officer gag. Rotted leaves, mold, and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit. On the kitchen wall, someone had written something in a dark brown smear. "Welcome back." The footage was later taken as evidence, though the police refused to release it. They said it was too unclear, too distorted to prove anything. But those who had seen it said there was one detail that the camera caught, something that still made them shiver. Just before the light went out, as Colin reached the porch, one could see a shadow move across the window beside the door. It was not his. It was too tall, too thin, and its head seemed to tilt at an impossible angle. For years, people have tried to explain what happened that Halloween night. Some say it was a cruel prank gone wrong. Others believe something older was awakened inside that house, something that had waited too long to be noticed again. But the story of Harrow's End remains. Every Halloween, children dare each other to walk down Birch Lane. They say if you knock on the old Miller door 3 times, you can still hear the echo of that boy's knock returning from inside, followed by a whisper that does not belong to you, and those who have heard it never speak about it again. They simply leave quietly before the fog rolls in, because sometimes the things we pretend to fear on Halloween are not make-believe at all. They wait for the one night of the year when the world pretends to forget that monsters ever existed, and they remind us that they never left. If you hear that whisper on Halloween night, run before it calls your name. Before the whispers began, before the pumpkins started rotting overnight, and before anyone spoke of the thing that moved inside the old Miller house. Harrow's End was the kind of town that did not make the news. It was a quiet settlement wrapped in fog and time, the sort of place where everyone knew everyone else, where people locked their doors out of habit, not fear. The seasons there were long and predictable. Winters were harsh, springs were wet, summers were lazy, and autumn was sacred. Every October the town transformed. Trees became embers, the air smelled of smoke and sweet cider, and the residents prepared for the festival that defined them, the Harvest Parade. It was a tradition older than the town itself, one that blurred the line between celebration and superstition. In those days, the festival was not just about pumpkins or costumes. It was a ritual of gratitude and caution. Old stories said that the harvest had to be honored with light, or the darkness beneath the fields would awaken. Every home carved lanterns, every family left a plate of bread and salt on their doorstep. And when the church bells rang at midnight, the townsfolk gathered to share a single, unspoken prayer, that nothing old or forgotten would come back with the cold wind. Most no longer believed in the tales told by their grandparents, but they followed the rituals anyway. Not out of faith, but out of memory. Fear, after all, has a way of surviving even when reason forgets. The Miller family had not been part of those traditions. They arrived in Harrow's End on a gray morning in 1997, quiet and polite, claiming they wanted a place away from the city. The house they bought had been empty for almost a decade, a 2-story wooden home near the edge of the forest, left untouched since the fire that took the lives of its former owners. The town had avoided that house ever since. Windows broke on their own, doors refused to stay shut, and lights flickered without power. Yet when the Millers moved in, they said it felt perfect, peaceful even. The locals watched them from a distance, curious and cautious. They were a small family, 2 parents and a daughter no more than 10 years old. The mother smiled often, the father fixed things around town for free, and their child, pale and quiet, was seen drawing strange shapes in the dirt whenever she waited for her parents. People said she talked to herself, or perhaps to something no one else could see. She told one neighbor that she liked her new room because the walls hum at night. The woman laughed it off the way adults do when children say strange things. But later, that same neighbor began hearing soft knocking sounds in her own house after midnight. 3 knocks, always from somewhere different. Over time, the Millers stopped coming into town. The father was rarely seen, and the mother's smile began to fade. The little girl stopped going to school altogether. When the sheriff tried to check on them, he found the mailbox overflowing and the porch covered in dead leaves. He knocked, but no one answered. Through the glass, he saw faint light inside, as if candles had been burning for days. When he returned with the deputy, the house was dark again. The family was gone, leaving behind furniture, dishes, and 3 jack-o'-lanterns lined neatly on the kitchen counter, each one still glowing. After that, no one wanted the house. It sat silent, watching over the town from its small hill, the wood graying year by year. Teenagers threw rocks at the windows and swore they saw something move behind the curtains. Hunters claimed the woods behind it were colder than the rest, that the ground there sank when stepped upon, as if something hollow lay beneath. One man, an old caretaker named Avery, took it upon himself to board up the windows. When asked why, He said that empty houses attract the wrong kind of company. He was found dead 2 weeks later, slumped over his table with a lantern still burning beside him. The sheriff ruled it a heart attack, but his daughter told a different story. She said he had not been able to sleep in days. She said he told her that every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Miller house, and every time he looked closer, someone was standing in the window smiling. Years passed. People stopped speaking of the family altogether. But the memory of their arrival remained, buried like a splinter under the skin of the town. Then one October, strange things began again. Pumpkins left on doorsteps were found split open the next morning, as if gnawed from the inside. The old church bell, long broken, rang once at midnight without wind, and in the silence that followed, the streetlights along Birch Lane flickered out, one by one, until only the light above the Miller house remained. That was the year the town decided not to hold the harvest parade. Some said it was because of the storm that swept through the week before. Others knew better. They said the earth had gone too long without its offering, that something under the soil had stirred, restless from being forgotten. Then came Halloween night. The night Colin disappeared. In the weeks that followed, people dug deeper into the town's history. Old church records revealed that the land where the Miller house stood had once been used for something older than farming. It had been part of a burial ground long before Harrow's End existed. According to the records, the early settlers had spoken of an entity that walked between the rows at harvest, a figure they called the Watcher of the Crooked Field. It was said to mark those who disrespected the harvest lights, who ignored the rituals meant to keep the soil from waking. The settlers believed that once marked, a person would vanish, taken back into the ground before the first frost. Most dismissed those stories as folklore. But when the sheriff read the accounts aloud at the town meeting, the room fell silent, because the last line of the old text spoke of something impossible. It said that those taken by the Watcher do not die. They wait beneath the roots until the next October, when the veil between worlds grows thin and they return to call the next by name. No one knew what to believe anymore. The fog grew thicker. The air grew colder, and at night, if one listened closely, the wind moving through the fields began to sound almost like breathing. The town of Harrow's End had always loved Halloween, but after that year, no one dared to celebrate again. They learned something that their ancestors had always known but never spoken aloud. Halloween was not just a night for tricks or laughter. It was a night of remembrance, a night of warning, and somewhere beyond the last porch light, something ancient still waited for those who forgot. By the time the sun fell behind the woods on that Halloween, the town of Harrow's End had already begun to change in ways that were hard to explain. The streets were quieter than before, as if the laughter of the children could not fill the air no matter how loudly they shouted. The wind came earlier that evening, colder and sharper than it should have been, carrying with it the scent of smoke, soil, and something metallic, something that did not belong. The sky was a bruised shade of violet, and as the fog rolled in from the woods, even the houses seemed to draw closer together, like frightened animals seeking warmth. The Miller house, hidden at the edge of Birch Lane, stood dark and still, its roof barely visible through the mist. The light above the porch was dead again, and no one expected it to return. The town tried to keep its traditions alive that year despite the unease. Children still wore costumes, parents still smiled, and the mayor lit the bonfire near the church square. Yet behind every forced laugh was an understanding, a quiet tension that no one dared to name. Everyone remembered what had happened to Colin. Everyone remembered the search parties that had found nothing but a flashlight, a folded costume, and a trail of faint prints that led to the Miller property, before stopping suddenly, as if the ground itself had swallowed them. The police had closed the case, calling it a disappearance, a runaway, an accident, but none of the explanations fit. No one could explain the voice that some claimed to hear near the house, a faint whisper that said the same words again and again. It is almost time. That Halloween night began like all the others. Groups of children wandered the neighborhood in costumes that now seemed like poor disguises against something unseen. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed faintly on porches, their grins distorted by flickering flames. The fog thickened around the streetlights, blurring their yellow glow until the world looked painted in shadows. Somewhere a dog barked and then went silent. The bonfire near the church sputtered, hissed, and died. though the wind was still. Some said later that it went out the very moment the clock struck 8. A small group of friends decided to walk down Birch Lane despite the warnings. They were older now, restless and curious. One of them carried a phone to record, saying they would prove that the stories were nothing more than town gossip. They joked as they walked, but their voices grew quieter with every step. The air was heavy there, thick enough that even breathing felt wrong. Every sound echoed too long. Their footsteps came back to them as if the ground itself whispered in return. When they reached the Miller house, the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. The house looked the same as ever, empty, fragile, forgotten, but something about it felt alive. The wood creaked softly even though there was no wind, and the front door was slightly open, swinging gently back and forth, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. The group stopped at the gate. One of them said they should leave. Another laughed nervously and stepped forward. That was when the porch light turned on. It was not a flicker or a flash, it burned bright and steady, flooding the porch in pale yellow light. The jack-o'-lanterns, long thought to have decayed, now glowed as if freshly carved. Their faces were not cheerful or playful. They were intricate and sharp, cut with precision that no child's hand could have managed. The eyes were hollow yet seemed to follow movement. The tallest boy, holding the camera, whispered that someone must be inside. But the others knew better. The house had been empty for years. The one who dared to move closer said later that the air near the porch felt wrong, thicker somehow, almost humming. The closer he got, the quieter the world became. Even the crickets stopped singing. He raised his hand to knock but froze when he noticed something carved into the wooden door. It was a symbol, a circle with a jagged line cutting through it, surrounded by smaller shapes that looked like eyes. Fresh cuts, clean and deep, as if carved only hours before. He reached out to touch it and his fingers came back wet. It was not paint. It was something darker. A sound came from inside then, a low scraping like wood dragging across the floor. The boy stumbled back, tripping over the steps as the camera swung wildly. The door creaked open wider, revealing only shadow. Something moved within that shadow, too fast to see clearly. A faint whisper crawled out into the fog, almost too quiet to hear. It said, "Who will light the lanterns this year?" The group ran. They did not look back, not even when one of them fell and scraped his knee. They kept running until the house disappeared behind the fog. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, one of them realized that the camera was gone. The boy who held it swore he dropped it on the porch, but no one dared to return for it. They told no one about what happened except one of the girls, who confided in her mother. The mother went to the police the next day, but when they went to check, the porch light was off again and the pumpkins were gone. 3 nights later, the camera was found. It was lying on the front steps of the church, covered in dirt and dried leaves. The footage was almost useless, grainy, distorted by static. But in the final few seconds, as the boy's hand reached for the door, there was a faint reflection in the glass. It showed a face, thin, gray, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. The face was smiling, though its mouth seemed carved rather than natural. After that night, Birch Lane was declared off limits. Police tape went up, though it never stayed for long. Someone or something kept tearing it down. People began hearing noises again, soft knocking from their basements, scratching at windows, footsteps along empty hallways. At first they thought it was the wind, but then the sounds began forming patterns. 3 knocks, always 3, just like the ones Colin had made years ago. Even stranger, every morning after Halloween, a new jack-o'-lantern appeared on someone's porch. It was never there the night before. The faces were always different, but the eyes were the same, wide, deep, and staring straight ahead. The pumpkins never rotted. They just sat there, glowing faintly even without candles inside. The people of Harrow's End learned to leave them alone. They stopped celebrating Halloween altogether. No decorations, no costumes, no laughter. The day became quiet, like a funeral that no one dared to acknowledge. Yet every October the fog still returned. The wind still whispered through the trees. And on Birch Lane the old house still waited, its porch light flickering faintly in the distance, as if reminding the town of what it had forgotten. It was no longer a story for children or a ghost tale told around fires. It was a truth buried deep in the soil, a truth that moved beneath their feet every autumn. Something had been woken that should have been left to sleep, something that had waited too many years for someone to knock again. And every year, When the fog thickened and the pumpkins began to glow on their own, the people of Harrow's End knew the same thing. The watcher of the crooked field had returned to count who still remembered, and who did not. The days that followed were cold and silent. The fog that had rolled in on Halloween refused to lift, hanging low over Harrow's End like a heavy curtain that dulled the color of everything it touched. The townspeople went about their lives with forced normalcy, pretending that nothing strange had happened, though they could not explain the feeling of being watched that crept into every moment of the day. The sunlight itself seemed weak, unable to break through the gray sky. The few who still lived near Birch Lane began noticing small things: doors that refused to stay locked, windows left open no matter how tightly they were sealed, and the faint smell of damp earth drifting into their homes even when there was no wind. It was as if the ground itself had started breathing again. The police investigation reopened quietly. The sheriff, a man named Brannigan, had lived in Harrow's End his entire life, and though he never said it aloud, he carried the same fear that everyone else did. He led a small team back to the Miller house to examine it one more time. The footage found on the church steps was locked away in evidence, but rumor spread quickly. People said there were things in the video no one could explain. Shapes that shifted in the background, a shadow that moved when no one was near, and that carved face reflected in the window. The sheriff himself had stopped the playback before the end, pale and trembling. Yet duty demanded he return to the house. When the team entered, the smell hit them first, a thick mixture of rot and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. The air inside was stale and damp, the kind of air that clings to the lungs and refuses to leave. The floors were warped from moisture, and the wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips. Every sound echoed too loudly. They found nothing on the first floor except dust and animal droppings, though one officer swore he heard faint footsteps above them. The others laughed it off until they reached the stairs. The wooden steps were covered in dirt, fresh and dark as though someone had tracked it in recently. Yet there were no footprints leading to or from them. Upstairs they found something worse. The hallway was narrow and dim, lined with closed doors. The first few rooms were empty, but the last door at the end of the hall had been sealed shut with thick wooden boards nailed from the inside. It should have been impossible. The sheriff called for the crowbar, and as they pried the boards free, something began to drip through the cracks. Thick, dark liquid ran down the door frame and pooled on the floor. The room beyond smelled like decay. When the door finally opened, their flashlights caught the sight of dozens of pumpkins lined neatly along the walls. Some were carved, some were not, but all were shriveled and darkened, their flesh sunken inward like dried skin. The carved ones bore strange symbols, not faces but markings that spiraled and looped into patterns that seemed to shift when stared at too long. Each one was set before a small blackened candle that had burned out long ago. The floorboards were covered with circles drawn in ash, intersecting lines that looked like the remains of some ritual. At the center of the room was a single wooden chair. Something had been tied to it long ago. The ropes were frayed and dark with age. The sheriff said later that the air in that room felt heavy, as if every breath cost something. His flashlight began to flicker, and one of the officers screamed when a pumpkin near the window burst open on its own, splitting down the middle and spilling something wet and white onto the floor. It was not seeds. It was wax. Dozens of small melted candle stubs poured out, each with a wick that had never been lit. The walls bore faint scratches, some deep enough to expose the wood beneath. There were words scrawled into the plaster, barely visible but legible when read aloud. "We kept the lights burning. Why did it stop watching?" They left the house soon after. The sheriff ordered the building sealed once more, though by the next morning the boards over the windows were gone. Not broken, not cut, simply gone, as if removed cleanly in the night. That same day, a report came from the local cemetery. The caretaker had found strange disturbances near the older graves, patches of soil that had sunk several inches, and fresh roots that seemed to twist upward toward the surface. The roots were pale and slick, almost like veins. Beneath one of them, something small was uncovered, a child's shoe half buried and filled with dark mud. It was dated from the early 1900s. No one in town recognized it. Word spread that the sheriff had taken something from the Miller house before leaving that night. Some said it was one of the carved pumpkins, others believed it was a book found hidden under the chair. Whatever it was, he never spoke of it again. He began missing church on Sundays and was seen walking the edge of Birch Lane after sunset, muttering to himself. When asked why, he only said that the light had to be kept alive, that someone had to keep it burning or the ground would remember. Meanwhile, the people of Harrow's End grew restless. Nights became longer, the fog heavier. Livestock refused to enter the fields near the Miller property, and every morning a fine layer of dirt appeared on the porches closest to the lane. The residents began dreaming again, vivid dreams of fields stretching endlessly, filled with hundreds of carved faces watching from the soil. Some woke to find their bedsheets damp with dirt. Local historians tried to find answers in the town archives. One researcher, a woman named Eileen, uncovered something remarkable in a collection of 19th-century letters written by the first settlers. The letters described a series of disappearances that occurred during harvest seasons more than a century ago. Each time the missing were children. The only clue left behind was a carved lantern left at their doorstep, glowing faintly through the night. The settlers believed it was an offering, both a warning and a promise that the land had claimed what it was owed. One passage in particular stood out. We feared the thing beneath the soil, the old spirit of the harvest that demands its light. We prayed it would sleep, but when the pumpkins ceased to burn, it came for us in silence. Eileen tried to share her findings with the sheriff, but by then, he had locked himself inside his home. Neighbors said they could see candlelight flickering through his window at all hours and sometimes faint chanting. One night, someone swore they heard his voice shouting the same words over and over, "Keep the light alive," followed by a sound like breaking glass. The next morning, his house was empty. On his table, they found a lantern made from a hollowed gourd, still burning with a small, steady flame. No wick, no oil, just fire that should not have existed. The sheriff's disappearance marked the turning point. What had once been whispers became dread. What had once been folklore became something no one could deny. The evidence was there, tangible, physical, but it refused to make sense. Every attempt to analyze it only deepened the mystery. Scientists who examined the carved pumpkins said the material inside was unlike any plant they knew. Investigators who stayed near the Miller house overnight left the next morning pale, shaking, unable to speak of what they saw. And through it all, the pumpkins continued to appear. Each Halloween, new ones lined the porches of Harrow's End, carved with precision, glowing with impossible light. Inside there were no candles, only soil, cold and damp. When they were split open, the glow would fade instantly, leaving nothing but the smell of earth and something faintly sweet, like the scent of decay after rain. The deeper they searched, the less they understood. Every clue led back to the same unanswered question. What was it that the settlers had buried beneath that field, and what had they promised to keep asleep? Somewhere beyond the edge of Birch Lane, the fog stirred as if in response. Something unseen moved beneath it, slow and patient. The town did not know it yet, but the harvest they had refused to honor had come due once more. And this time, the light they needed to keep it away would not come from any lantern they could build. The following weeks hollowed Harrow's End from the inside. People no longer spoke of the Miller house directly, but their silence was thick enough to suffocate anyone who tried. Curtains remained drawn even during the day, and shops closed earlier each evening, leaving the streets empty long before sunset. The once lively chatter at the diner was gone. The jukebox stood unplugged, its silence louder than music. Fear had changed the town, not into chaos but into stillness. It was a stillness that made every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind scraping across the windows, sound like a whisper from something waiting just outside. The families who lived closest to Birch Lane were the first to leave. Some did not even pack. They drove off in the night without telling anyone, abandoning homes, furniture, and memories. Those who stayed behind found their world shrinking, their lives circling around the same dark thought that the ground beneath them was not resting anymore. Rumors spread in quiet voices. People said the fog was thicker near the old house now, so thick that lights from passing cars disappeared completely when they entered it. Someone claimed to see a figure standing in the mist, tall and thin, watching the town from a distance. Others swore that they could hear a child crying from deep within the woods at night, calling for help, though no one dared to go and see. For the first time in decades, no one spoke of celebrating Halloween. The mayor canceled all town events, citing safety concerns. Decorations were thrown away and pumpkins were left uncarved to rot quietly on porches. Yet still, when midnight came, the smell of burning wax drifted through the streets. No one knew where it came from. Some locked their doors and prayed. Others simply sat in the dark, waiting for the morning that always felt slower to arrive. But fear has a way of slipping into more than routine. It infects the mind. People began to dream again. At first, the dreams were small, a flickering light in the distance, a door that opened on its own, a voice whispering a name. But over time, they grew vivid and cruel. In their dreams, the townspeople saw fields stretching endlessly beneath a blood-red sky. Pumpkins filled the land from one horizon to the other, their carved faces glowing faintly through the mist. Between them moved a figure, bent and thin, its limbs impossibly long, dragging something behind it that left a dark trail in the soil. Every night the figure came closer, and every morning, those who dreamed it woke to find traces of dirt on their sheets or under their fingernails. The psychologist who lived in the next county called it shared hysteria. He said it was a manifestation of collective trauma, a response to fear reinforced by rumor and isolation. He tried to visit the town once. He stayed a single night in the local inn and left before dawn without speaking to anyone. The innkeeper later said that he spent the entire night sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, muttering that the wallpaper was breathing. It was not only dreams that began to unravel. The people themselves changed. They looked paler, thinner, as if something was slowly drawing the color out of them. The laughter of children became rare. Their play grew quiet, nervous. Teachers noticed the children drawing the same image again and again during class. Fields full of carved faces, a house with no windows, a shadow that stretched too far. The drawings were confiscated, but new ones appeared every day. When asked what the picture meant, one girl simply said, "They are waiting for the light." The adults tried to find logic where none existed. They changed locks, left lights on, and slept with radios playing static just to drown out the silence. Some turned to religion, but even the pastor could not calm them. During one Sunday service, the candles in the church refused to light. The matches broke one after another. The wicks blackened but did not burn. The congregation sat in the dark as the pastor's hands shook. He finally said that perhaps the town had angered something that did not forgive. Colin's mother became the town's ghost long before she died. Every evening, she walked to the edge of Birch Lane, carrying a small lantern, waiting until the fog thickened so much that she could not see her own feet. She said she heard him calling from beyond it. Some tried to stop her, but she only smiled faintly and whispered that she had promised him she would come if he ever got lost. One night she did not return. The next morning her lantern was found standing upright in the dirt near the old gate, still burning. It was after that night that the disappearances began again. A boy walking home from the library, a farmer checking his fields, an old woman visiting her sister, all gone without trace. Each time their homes were found with a single pumpkin on the doorstep, freshly carved and faintly glowing. The carvings were detailed, lifelike, and familiar. When looked at closely, each one resembled the face of the person who had vanished. Inside, instead of seeds, there was damp soil and a single smooth stone engraved with the same circular mark found on the Miller door. Grief became a constant companion in Harrow's End. People spoke little, ate little, slept even less. The faces in town looked hollow, haunted. Some claimed to hear tapping under their floors, faint and steady, as if someone were knocking from beneath the boards. Others swore the earth in their gardens was moving on its own, the soil rising and falling like breathing. The fear was no longer just a feeling. It had become part of the place itself, woven into the walls, the air, and the trembling hands of those who remained. By December, the fog still had not lifted. The cold came early that year, but the ground refused to freeze. Farmers who tried to dig the soil said it bled water and gave off heat like a sleeping body. One man unearthed something that looked like a root but felt like bone. He threw it back and left town the next morning, never to return. The emotional weight of it all began to twist the living. Husbands stopped trusting their wives. Mothers whispered to their children that if they heard someone calling their name after dark, they must never answer. A few people took their own lives quietly, leaving behind notes that said only, "It wanted the light." Even the animals felt it. Birds stopped landing near Birch Lane. Dogs whined and scratched at doors as if begging to be let out of town. The forest itself grew quiet. No crickets, no rustle of deer, only the steady sigh of the fog. And then came the first thaw in spring. When the snow melted, the people of Harrow's End found something strange in the fields. Hundreds of small lanterns, half buried in the earth, made from gourds hardened by frost. None had wicks, none had candles, but all of them glowed faintly in the morning light, like dying embers refusing to fade. For a moment, hope stirred that maybe it was ending, that whatever haunted them had burned itself out. But that night, as the last lantern dimmed, the wind changed. The town could hear something low and distant moving through the fog, like the groan of earth splitting open. It came from the direction of Birch Lane. Some said they saw a light within the fog that night, tall, flickering, moving slowly down the road. It was not fire. It was not a lantern. It was something else, something alive. Those who saw it said it looked like a figure made of shadow and flame, carrying the glow of every lantern the town had ever lit. It passed through the fog and stopped in front of the old Miller house. And for the first time in years, every jack-o'-lantern in Harrow's End lit up at once, burning with cold, white fire. No one slept that night. No one ever forgot it, because in that moment, every person who remained in Harrow's End understood the same thing. It had never been the house that was cursed. It had been the ground beneath it, breathing, watching, remembering. And now, it was awake again. When the lights burned through the fog that night, every explanation the townspeople had ever trusted began to collapse. The local police refused to comment on the glowing pumpkins, the strange warmth radiating from the earth, or the sounds that people swore they heard coming from beneath the ground. The newspapers in nearby counties ran cautious stories, half disbelief, half mockery, suggesting pranksters, hysteria, or chemical contamination from old farmland. But no scientist came to investigate, and the ones who did never stayed long enough to collect samples. There was something about Harrow's End that seemed to turn curiosity into fear the longer one stayed. Even outsiders began to feel it, that creeping sensation that someone was always standing just behind them. Still, the need for answers did not fade. A small group of residents, desperate for understanding, formed their own circle of inquiry. They met every Thursday in the basement of the library, huddled around stacks of old newspapers and borrowed historical records. Among them was Eileen, the historian who had found the settlers' letters, and Father Alden, the pastor who had not preached since the night his candles failed to light. They worked quietly, fearing ridicule from what remained of the town, yet they could not let the mystery rest. Each believed that if they could piece together what had happened to the Miller family, and to the land itself, they might break whatever hold it had on the town. Eileen began by tracing property records back to the earliest maps of the area. What she discovered chilled her. The Miller house had not been built on an ordinary plot of land. The original deed described it as Plot 13 Crooked Field, a section excluded from church ownership in the late 1800s because of unwholesome ground. It was listed as unsuitable for burial, farming, or habitation. The reason was never written, but an attached note in faded ink said only, "Soil reclaimed by what should never have been named." Father Alden brought in his own research, drawn from church archives. He found records of exorcisms performed in nearby villages during the same period, all connected to the harvest season. The victims were described as those who spoke with the buried. In every case, the afflicted were said to dig holes in the ground at night, whisper into them, and cover them again with earth. When confronted, they claimed that the ground whispers back. Those records ended abruptly in 1892, the same year the earliest settlers abandoned the original church that had once stood on the edge of the forest less than a mile from where the Miller house would later be built. The group's meetings grew stranger as they continued. The air in the library basement felt colder, and their candles, used out of habit after the town's frequent blackouts, often sputtered for no reason. Sometimes they swore the smell of soil followed them inside, faint but present as though the earth itself was listening. They started to notice that their research kept circling back to one phrase found repeatedly across letters, sermons, and burial ledgers: keep the lanterns burning. It appeared everywhere, sometimes as advice, sometimes as warning. The settlers believed that carving pumpkins, lighting candles, and leaving them outside on the final night of October served a sacred purpose. It was not simply a ritual of harvest or superstition. It was meant to keep something bound. The pumpkins were seals, the lights were sentinels, and when the ritual stopped, the boundary weakened. Over time, the story of fear became tradition, and the purpose was forgotten. The group debated what exactly had been kept bound. Eileen leaned toward the rational, the idea that the settlers' fears were metaphorical, symbolic of disease or starvation. But Father Alden could not accept that. He said faith had taught him to recognize the pattern of old evil, the kind that does not die but waits. He believed something ancient had once dwelled beneath the crooked field, something the settlers had mistaken for a god when it was anything but. When asked why it had returned now, he said, "Because no one remembers to feed what the dead kept full." Their sessions became darker after that. One night, a young man who had joined them for curiosity's sake claimed to hear whispering from the floor beneath his chair. He thought it was the old pipes until he leaned closer and made out words. "You found the door." He fled the meeting and never came back. 2 days later, he was reported missing. The sheriff's office searched the woods, but all they found was his jacket hanging from the Miller gatepost, its sleeve filled with damp soil. Despite their fear, Eileen pressed on. She discovered the sheriff's missing journal in a box at the station, pages half-burned, written in a frantic scrawl. It revealed that before his disappearance, he had been studying the Miller family's genealogy. He found that they were not newcomers to Harrow's End as everyone had assumed. Their ancestors had lived there before, among the first settlers in fact, and had been responsible for maintaining the lantern rituals. They were called keepers. When the line broke, when no one remained to light the pumpkins, the watchers beneath the earth were free to stir. The sheriff had written one final note before the entry stopped. "The child heard them first. That is how it begins again." That single sentence tore through the group like a curse. The child. The Miller girl. Her drawings of faces in the soil. Her claim that the walls of her room hummed at night. It all connected, a pattern centuries in the making. The keepers had returned unknowingly to their own cursed soil, and by failing to perform the ritual, they had opened the door their ancestors had buried shut. In the weeks that followed, Father Alden tried to perform a cleansing ceremony near the Miller property. He took holy water, scripture, and a group of 5 volunteers. None of them spoke about what happened there, but witnesses from a distance saw strange light flickering among the trees and heard shouting that turned to screaming. By dawn, only Father Alden remained, sitting in the mud, his cross bent, his hands covered in ash. He never spoke again. The government eventually intervened. Harrow's End was marked as an unsafe zone due to environmental contamination. The roads leading to Birch Lane were blocked, and the remaining residents were urged to evacuate. Some left quietly, others refused, claiming they had nowhere else to go. For those who stayed, the nights became longer still. The air grew thick with that familiar smell of soil and sweetness, the same scent that had haunted every horror since the beginning. Then came the reports, grainy security footage from a highway camera outside town. It showed the fog rolling across the road, followed by shapes of light, hundreds of tiny, flickering lanterns moving in a single line as if guided by unseen hands. The footage ended abruptly, the camera lens cracking with a flash of white. When the maintenance team arrived, they found the ground beneath the pole split open, roots dangling into the dark like fingers reaching upward. 3 weeks later, Eileen disappeared. Her home was found in perfect order, books neatly stacked, her teacup still warm. On her desk was a single sheet of paper with a short note written in careful handwriting. "I understand now. The pumpkins were not to keep it out. They were to keep it in." The note was dated October 30th. After that, no one met in the library basement again. Theories scattered like ashes. Some said the town had fallen victim to mass delusion. Others whispered of something far older, a living hunger beneath the earth, something that borrowed faces and voices from those it took. Whatever truth might have existed became buried under the same silence that had always protected Harrow's End. Only one thing remained constant. Every Halloween, despite the town being abandoned, travelers passing the area at night reported the same sight, a faint pulsing glow rising from the woods where the Miller house once stood. Not a bonfire, not streetlights, just hundreds of small flickering lanterns burning in perfect rows, and if one stood long enough to listen, the wind carried a sound through the fog, low, rhythmic, and steady, like breathing, or like something under the ground knocking once more to be let out. Years passed, and Harrow's End was erased from most maps. The signs leading to it rusted until the letters flaked away, and the road that once curved into Birch Lane was swallowed by weeds and silence. Time forgot what people chose not to remember, yet the earth did not forget. Every autumn, travelers who took the long route through the valley spoke of a faint orange haze rising from the woods, where no town should have existed. They described it as the color of dying fire, the kind that burns without warmth. When they passed that way, radios turned to static, headlights dimmed, and the air grew thick, almost heavy enough to choke on. None could say for certain what it was, only that it felt wrong, as if the ground itself had eyes. The government never returned. Officially, the land was condemned due to toxic ground instability, a story made to keep people out. But even miles away, things began to happen that could not be contained by words like contamination. Farmers in neighboring counties found perfect circles of blackened soil in their fields each November, soft and warm beneath the frost. Motorists reported seeing carved faces glowing in the ditches at night, like eyes peering up from the dirt. One man swore he saw a figure walking beside his car as he drove past the ruins of Harrow's End. Tall, thin, its head tilting too far as it matched his speed, its smile carved wider with every mile. But perhaps the most haunting truth was that some people who had once lived in Harrow's End still dreamed of it. No matter how far they moved, they saw the same vision again and again. Fog crawling through the trees, faint laughter of children, and the flicker of candlelight from a window that should not exist. The dreams always ended the same way, with the sound of 3 knocks echoing from somewhere close. Some tried to dismiss it, but others woke to find dirt on their windowsills, as if something had pressed its hand there during the night. The world had forgotten the story, but stories have a way of surviving without words. They move through people the way roots move through soil, quietly, invisibly, until one day they break the surface again. Scholars who stumbled across fragments of Eileen's notes began to write papers about ritualistic folklore persistence. None of them knew the truth behind her final line. To them, it was an interesting metaphor. To those who had lived it, it was the last warning left by someone who understood too late. Every decade or so, someone ventures back. Journalists, paranormal investigators, wanderers chasing stories that promise fame. The recordings they bring back are always the same, unusable. The video fractures into static, the sound distorts, and the final frame always captures a faint glow deep in the fog. A light that should not be there. A light that pulses like a heartbeat. Some swear they hear voices within the static, whispering fragments of sentences. It remembers. Feed the light. Keep the door shut. One of those who returned was a man named Ellis. He had been a child in Harrow's End before his family fled. For years he convinced himself that the memories were false, that what he saw as a boy, the jack-o'-lanterns glowing with white fire, the fog breathing like a living thing, had been dreams twisted by time. But when his daughter was born, the dreams returned. They began softly, his old home seen in perfect detail, the porch lamp flickering in the distance. Then they grew sharper, clearer, until he could feel the damp air on his skin again. In his final dream before he went back, he saw himself standing in the field behind the Miller house. The soil beneath his feet was moving, rising, and from it came hundreds of carved faces pushing upward like growing roots. When he woke, his hands were covered in dirt. Ellis drove to where the town used to be in early October. The road was cracked, the trees taller, but the air was the same. Cold and still, carrying the faint smell of something sweet beneath the rot. He parked near where he thought the main square had been, though all that remained were the outlines of foundations, the skeletons of homes buried under vines. He carried a lantern with him, not electric but oil. He said he wanted to see it the old way. The locals in the nearest town warned him not to stay after dark. He laughed. He did not laugh again. His recordings were found weeks later by hikers. The first few minutes were uneventful. Birds, the crunch of leaves, his voice softly describing the ruins. But near sunset the tone changed. He began breathing harder, whispering to himself. He said he could hear something humming beneath the ground like bees inside the earth. Then silence. For several minutes only wind. Then a voice, faint, a child's voice. You came back. The recording ended with 3 slow knocks and the sound of dirt shifting. Ellis was never found. After his disappearance, interest in Harrow's End faded completely. It was as if the land itself had reclaimed the memory of him. But every few years, the same stories rise again. Travelers passing through in late autumn, seeing a light between the trees, hearing whispers when there should only be wind. The fog returns heavier each year, crawling farther out of the valley, creeping toward the highways. Some locals believe the boundary that once confined the watcher has dissolved entirely, that the pumpkin's light, once meant to contain it, has finally gone out. Others say that Harrow's End was never destroyed, only hidden, that if you drive far enough into the valley on the right kind of night, you will find it exactly as it was, with houses lit, bonfires glowing, and children laughing in the streets. But if you step too close, if you cross into the glow, the laughter stops, the windows go dark, and when you turn around, the road you came from is gone. There are those who believe that the watcher does not want victims. It wants witnesses. It wants its story remembered. Every light, every whisper, every dream is its way of reminding the living that it never died. The settlers built their rituals not to keep it away, but to honor the pact that let them survive beside it. When that pact was broken, the lanterns went out, and when the lanterns went out, something hungry woke beneath the roots. No one knows where it will surface next. Some believe it follows those who escaped, moving through generations like a shadow passed down in blood. Others say it is still there, sleeping beneath the ground that was never meant to be disturbed, its heart beating slowly under the soil, waiting for the night when someone somewhere forgets the old warning. So if one October you find yourself driving a lonely road and you see a faint orange glow through the fog, stop. Do not approach. Do not look too long. Whatever waits there is not meant for you. Keep your lights on. Keep moving. Because if you ever see the shape of a face carved into a pumpkin by the roadside, glowing with no flame inside it, do not mistake it for decoration. It is not a greeting. It is a sign. And somewhere beneath your feet the ground may already be listening.